We're in Genesis chapter 37 tonight. You might recall that the last time we had that experience of going through the strange chapter 36, the list of the descendants of Esau, and it is indeed a strange focus, but we look at that in the context of the story of Jacob. And so we see Jacob, the Jacob narrative ends with Jacob. He's living in a tent, his family moving around, and yet Esau gets his own country. We don't want to confuse the physical blessings that you might experience on this earth with the spiritual blessings that God gives, because even though Jacob lives in a tent, moves around, doesn't really get his own land yet, God's promised it to him, but he won't get it until the future. Yet he's the son of promise. He's the one that God has blessed and is using. So in distinction to Esau, so Genesis 36 is about Esau, but now we see that the main narrative of the book picks up with the line of Jacob, but now the focus is not going to be on Jacob anymore. It's going to move to his son Joseph. So we pick up in verse 1 of Genesis 37, and it says that Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. And the aptness of these verses is a transition from the genealogy of Esau to the story of Joseph. And you had all those chieftains. Remember in Genesis 36, it talked about these chiefs and these kings. And it's like God is saying now, but I have my king. And the story is advancing. It's going to give us a glimpse of the king that's going to come through the line of Jacob. Of course, we know ultimately that's Jesus. But first there is Joseph. And Joseph is going to become like a king. He's going to become sort of prime minister of Egypt. But before he gets there, we have to see the way that the Lord works in his life. So these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 7 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. So Joseph is the little brother, and he's out with his half-brothers, the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, the handmaidens. And we're not told what they did. They did something that wasn't good. Maybe they didn't tend the sheep like they should. Maybe they, who knows what bad thing they could have done. Whatever it was, Joseph went back and he told. He brought a bad report. Now, that never goes over well with brothers when somebody snitches. And that's exactly what he does. So notice the first glimpse we get of Joseph makes us sort of not like him. I mean, nobody likes it when someone tells on you. And so the author here is sort of, he's bringing us into, we're going to see Joseph primarily in this chapter, through the eyes of his brothers. And he's not a terribly sympathetic character at first. I mean, we don't think he deserves what he gets here, but we get that they don't like him. He's clearly the favorite. The first thing we see him do is he snitches. We're going to find out he's the favorite. His father shows him favoritism that the others don't enjoy. And there's just, he sort of seems to be a braggart. He brags about these dreams that he's had, that the rest of them are going to serve him. So I just want you to see, remember, we always are looking at what the author is doing. Why does he tell it the way he tells us? And the thing that he's doing here is making us sort of sympathetic to the brothers at first. We get that they don't like him. He's not a likable guy. Now, what does he do wrong? Well, nothing really. You look at this chapter, he doesn't do anything wrong, He never breaks a commandment, but we don't like him because, he doesn't do anything wrong, but he seems to tell on the others. Excuse me. He points out that he's the favorite. He even says to his father, "You're all going to bow down and bow down to me one day." So let's see how the author unfolds this. Now Israel loved Jacob more than any of his sons because he was the son of his old age. Now, just point out, remember, Joseph is not the youngest son. That would be Benjamin, right? Benjamin is the youngest son. Rachel dies in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. But Joseph is still a son of his father's old age. His father had a lot of other children first, and he's the first son of Rachel. So you can see Rachel was is the woman that he loved the most, his favorite wife. He clearly loved her. Leah, he accepted in the deceit, but he really loved Rachel. He always loved Rachel more, and this is her son, so he sort of loves him more. So Israel, that is Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. Robert Alter, in his translation, translates this an ornamented tunic. So it's a very specific article of clothing. It's like a tunic. It's not the long flowing robe. It's mentioned elsewhere in the Bible. Oddly enough, remember the story of David in 2 Samuel 13, when one of David's sons rapes his half-sister Tamar, and there it mentions a tunic. In fact, if you study the story of the rape of Tamar, you get a whole lot of allusions that point back to the story of Joseph. It's clearly intentional. And there we're told that this ornamented tunic was worn by the virgin princesses. So this is not a garment that is particular to either men or women. It would be a garment commonly worn by both, and it's sort of a product of ancient haute couture. It's sort of high fashion. This is not the typical thing you wear when tending sheep or taking care of the house. So if princesses wear it and Jacob gives it to his son Joseph to show his affection, it's some kind of a garment that is set apart from everyday use. And these tunics are like on Egyptian frescoes, and there are a lot of different places in the ancient world they show up. But clearly, this indicates that Joseph is Jacob's favorite, that he treats him like royalty. And of course, Joseph is a snitch, and now he's the favorite. So already we understand this kid's not liked by his older brothers. And it says in verse 4, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. So not only did they hate him, they let him know that they hated him. They could never speak peacefully to him. Here's another evidence that polygamy never worked, and it didn't in this case. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. Again, notice the way the author tells us that detail. And what on earth, why would a dream make you hate somebody even more? I mean, most of the time, I don't know about you, but I dream crazy stuff. I dream stuff that makes no sense, even to me. And if I tell it, you might think, boy, that's weird. What kind of a psychology does this guy have? But I don't think it would make you hate me. But Joseph's dream makes his brothers hate him. So what is the dream? He said to them, hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field. By the way, notice how he says, behold. another way to translate this would be, look, look. And it's a little word that occurs in Hebrew that it's like, and look what happened, and then look. And so he's really emphasizing this. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. So he's like, we're out, cutting wheat and putting the wheat in the sheaves. My sheaves stood upright, all of your sheaves bowed down. Now, you don't have to be a dream interpreter to get that one. And they get it. They say, are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now, if you are the hated brother, if you're the younger brother, remember, so Reuben, the oldest brother, would have been a lot older, maybe 20 years older than Joseph. And if you're the younger brother and your older brothers all hate you because you're the favorite, because you snitch, because you told us this silly dream you had that says we all bow down to you, what do you think your reaction would be? At some point, don't you go, I better shut my mouth. I better quit talking because every time I say something, these guys hate me more. Now, that's what normal people would do, but not Joseph. Look what he does. Verse 9, then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, behold, I've dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. So notice here you have, the author's given us basically what's called doubling. You have the same story sort of told two different ways, two different dreams. And this doubling is portentous to us. It tells us, oh, something's going to happen. I mean, our expectation as readers is that, this is sort of like, remember the guy, the movie director putting the camera on the knife that the woman lays down, and you go, oh, that knife's coming back into the story. And here we get two dreams that say they're going to bow down to him. So immediately, the author's telling us this is going to come true. Again, later there are going to be dreams that occur that maybe we wouldn't be able to interpret. We wouldn't understand what they mean when Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams. But here, these dreams are really obvious. We get exactly what they mean. And the author gives us this doublet, and that's a sort of an organizing principle you see throughout the Joseph story. And in this dream, the second version of it, there's something different from the first. Remember, that's what I call a zone of turbulence. When you see things that are repeated, you got same, different. Sort of notice the different thing because that's a point of emphasis. In the first one, you have the brothers bowing down, but in this one, you have the brothers and the mom and the dad. Now, this is interesting because his mother's dead, right? His mother's dead. And there are liberal scholars who read this and go, look at this. This is clearly the work of, you have multiple sources, and this isn't one author. And clearly this indicates that this isn't really one story, but it comes from a lot of different places because, look here, a mistake made it into the text. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm gonna say that if I believed that this came from multiple sources and there were an editor, I'm going to assume that editor could read as well as I can. And if an editor let that in, he did so on purpose. Now, I don't believe this is from multiple sources. I think Moses wrote it. When Jesus quotes from the Pentateuch, he says, Moses said, and I believe Moses wrote it. So I reject that kind of criticism of the Bible. But we do need to answer that. The cause of the criticism is, oh, look at that. His mother bows down to him, but she's already dead. She died in childbirth with Benjamin. There are a couple of possibilities. One is that this is not entirely chronological, and chronology is not a big thing in the Old Testament, so that everything happens exactly in sequence. We tend to organize stories and histories that way, but the ancient world not so much. So it's possible that this occurs really before the death of Benjamin. Like some of this, the part about them hating him, that could actually cover a lot of years. It could have been very early that he has the dream. And that there could be a lot of years between the time he has these dreams and the time that he gets sold into slavery. We know Benjamin is alive by then, but maybe this has been going on for a long time. So that's one possibility. The other is, though, that it's a dream, and the point of the dream is that he's going to be elevated above all of his family. And, you know, in a dream, it wouldn't be an unusual thing for people who are dead to be in the dream, and the point remains the same. So I don't see that as a terribly troubling, I don't think of it as a mistake. It's just at all. It's just Joseph having a dream and saying that he gets what the dream means. My family is going to bow down to me. And in the same way, those of us who have parents who have gone on to glory, there's a very real sense in which we still think of them as our parents, and we talk about our mom and dad and feel their presence. So I don't think this is really a great problem to have to overcome. And when Jacob answers him, he said, "Shall I and your mother bow down to you?" Of course, that's just not a strange thing that Jacob would say that, because like, even if Rachel's dead, he's like, what are you saying? Your mother and I are going to come bow down to you? The whole thing is incredulous. What are you saying, that we're going to bow down to you? And the point of the dream is that his whole family is going to bow down to him. And that's true of his mother, who, though she's dead, it happens in the sense that she is the wife of Jacob, who will bow down to him, and the mother of Benjamin, who will bow down to him. So both things are true. So he continues on, is verse 11, his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. Do you recognize there, we've seen that elsewhere, like in Luke, when it says that Mary treasured these things in her heart, remember? And every time you see that, it's like the author telling us this is going to come back, right? She's treasuring this in her heart for a reason. This is going to bear fruit later in the story. And the fact that Jacob keeps this in his heart because he anticipates something else is coming, and indeed it is. Now look at verse 12. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. So Shechem is in the region later became known as Samaria. The modern day town there is Nablus. And it's on the west bank. It's in that central mountain region of Israel. And his brothers are there, and they're feeding their flocks. And Israel, that's Jacob, said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he went from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields. So he goes to Shechem, and You don't have cell phones, so he's having to go around every little hillside and every little wadi and see if he can find his brothers in the flocks, and he's not finding them. But a man sees him wandering around looking for somebody, and he says, "What are you seeking?" Verse 16, "I'm seeking my brothers. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They've gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. So this is here you have the plot. We've been set up to not like him. We get it. He's a snitch and thinks that he's better than everybody else and all that. He doesn't have the discretion not to tell these dreams. But now when these words land rather hard, they see him coming and they immediately start talking about killing him. You know, a lot of older brothers would play a prank or do something mean, but they immediately go all the way to murder. Their hearts are murderous, and it doesn't matter that he's their own flesh and blood. And they said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer." You hear the sarcasm in their voices, don't you? It suggests that man, they don't like him and they feel justified in don't liking him. Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. So there are these natural pits around there. You've got like sort of natural caves in the hillsides. You've got sinkholes that open up. Remember, I told you this is right there it's the Great Rift Valley, two tectonic plates. There are lots of earthquakes. The earth opens up. There are natural pits all over the place. And they say, we can kill him and throw his body into one of those pits. He'll never be found. They said, then we'll say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. Now, I want to point out that the Bible, the worldview of the Bible is that God really is in control, that God knows everything that's going to happen, that nothing happens outside of the sovereignty of God, that the tiniest little detail in the universe is under the control of God. That is the biblical view. God knows everything that's going to happen, and nothing's going to surprise God. It's never going to deviate from his plan and his purpose and his foreknowledge. At the same time, the same Bible that gives us that worldview of God never gives us a fatalistic view. Like, well, since it's all going to happen anyway, it doesn't matter what we do. You never hear anybody in the Bible ever do that. They don't act like, oh, well, there's nothing you can do. Remember, David one time was in a little village called Keilah, and he hears that Saul is coming to get him. And he asks God, are they going to give me over to Saul? And God says, they are. And so David leaves. He doesn't go, well, then there's nothing I can do. If that's going to happen, I'm just stuck. He leaves. And you see this view that ultimately, though from the human perspective, it looks like things change, that outcome was still always what God planned. You think about Jonah. God says, tell Nineveh I'm going to destroy them. Jonah goes and preaches that God's going to destroy you. And they repent, and they are not destroyed. So, though we believe in the absolute sovereignty of God, we don't question God is completely in control of the most minute detail of the universe. All things are going to happen just like he said. It's never a cause for fatalism. And I'm going to give the brothers at least this, that they're good theologians. They see him coming, and they go, we're going to take care of him, and then we'll see what will become of his dreams. Now, they're good theologians, they're just bad human beings. And so they think that by killing him, they can make his dreams come to nothing. Of course, we've already been cued by being told the dreams, by being told that Jacob, he keeps this in his heart. He keeps this memory of the dreams. That sort of tips us off something's going to come of the dreams. But before it does, Joseph has a long way to go, doesn't he? And so they've got the plot, kill him, throw his body in the pit. But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. Now, man, remember Reuben's a stone cold killer, right? Reuben's the guy that goes in and slaughters that whole village when the men had agreed to be circumcised. And yet here now, is it remorse because of that, the trouble that he caused? Jacob said, you've caused me to be a stench in the people. Now I'm hated. And does he feel guilty for that? Or is there some compassion he has for Joseph because he is his brother? We're not told his reasons, but we are told that he has this pang of conscience, and he devises a way to save his life. And he says, let's not take his life. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him. So Reuben suggests, just throw him in the pit, as though, hey, if you do that, he'll die anyway, but his blood won't be on your hand. You didn't actively kill him. But his plan was, at the end of verse 22, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to their father. So Reuben hates him, but he loves his father. And so he goes, man, I can't kill him. I'm going to spare him, bring him back to my dad. So when Joseph came to his brothers, verse 23, you can imagine, excuse me, see you sort of get the scene. Joseph is walking along rather naively. He sees them from the distance. Hey, it's my brothers. And he's coming up to them. And the whole time they're looking at him. You can picture them sort of smiling. Oh, yeah. And the whole time, here comes this dreamer. We'll take care of him. They have this whole conversation about what they're going to do with him. Joseph is walking toward them the whole time. And when he gets there, they take him. The very first thing they do, they strip him of that ornamented tunic. They take that off of him, and then they throw him in the pit. And the pit was empty. There was no water in it. So it tells us sort of what time of year it is. It's not in the rainy season of the winter because when the rains come, those pits will hold the water. And so it's dry. He's thrown in the pit. And then look at what they do, verse 25. Then they sat down to eat. There's a real sense of callousness there, isn't there? I can't imagine that Joseph is just being quiet. But they don't care. They throw him in the pit, and then they sit down to eat. They'll figure out what to do with him, or they'll let nature take its course. But as they're eating, they looked up and they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing gum and balm and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he's our brother, our own flesh. Now, by the way, if they're Ishmaelites, they're cousins, right? They're cousins. Because Ishmael was, remember, the other son of Abraham, 2 generations back. So Jacob's father is Isaac. and Ishmael is Isaac's half-brother. So these are Ishmaelites, and but the Ishmaelites have not quite, they don't have this connection to Joseph. What's it to them? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let not our hand be upon him, for he's our brother and our own flesh. And so now Judah joins Reuben in saying, let's not kill him. Let's go with plan B. And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Now, this is a fascinating detail to me. I never hear anybody talk about this. The brothers see the Ishmaelites coming and say, we can sell him to them, but they don't do it. They get these Midianites, which is down, like around Sinai, down in the land between Israel and Egypt. So these guys from Midian have come up. Again, this would be on. There was a road along the coast called the Via Maris, and then this is the road along the hills. You could go either way, coming down the length of Israel. And they're up in the hills, but the trade route is the same. It's Damascus to the northeast, and then Egypt down in the southwest. And so they're coming down that trade route, and they get the Midianites to get Joseph out of the pit and sell him to the Ishmaelites. So they don't actually do the deed. Now, I just got to point out the kind of mental gymnastics that we will perform in order to absolve ourselves of guilt when really we're guilty. We play games with ourselves and saying, I can't, number one way this pops up, I can't tell you how many times that I counsel people who are addicted to pornography, and they'll say, well, it's not the same thing as committing adultery. At least I didn't do that. Okay, see what you're doing right there? You're justifying your sin. You're comparing your sin to something you consider worse in order to make you feel better about your sin. And we do that. We get ourselves into all kinds of sin, and then, but now here's a line I won't cross. Well, you've already crossed a line. They've already had murder in their hearts. They've plotted his death, and then they settled on selling him into slavery. But, let's get these Midianites to do that. The Midianites get him out of the pit. The Midianites sell him to the Ishmaelites. We didn't do it. But clearly, they're morally responsible. They sell him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Then they took Joseph to Egypt. Now, I just want to point out what is sort of obvious. If you read the whole Bible, you see an awful lot of similarities here with Jesus. It's obvious. I don't call Joseph a type of Christ. I think a type of Christ is when we're told in the scripture that something stands for Jesus. And there are lots of types, like the Passover lamb. In the New Testament, we're told Jesus is our Passover lamb. So we can say that the Passover lamb is a type. So I reserve that word type for a very narrow and specific category of things in the Old Testament that are revealed in the New Testament as pictures of Jesus. So I don't think this is a type. What I do think it is what I'll call a motif. And that is, there are certain storylines that you see in the New Testament about Jesus that you get glimpses of throughout the Old Testament, like being sold for pieces of silver. Now for Jesus it's 30, for Joseph it's 20, but wow, you really can't mistake that. That's being hated by his brothers. Remember, Jesus' physical brothers don't accept him during his earthly ministry. And they say he's crazy. They call him crazy. He's beside himself. So they don't accept him. his brothers of Israel, the other Jews, what do? They crucify him. And Psalm 22 uses the language of being in a pit. Jesus quotes Psalm 22 on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And so you just see an awful lot of similarities. The royal robe being stripped off of him. Well, you clearly see Jesus lays aside his heavenly robes and he becomes like us in the likeness of human flesh. And there's just an awful lot of storylines here that once we know the story of Jesus, it sure makes the story of Joseph come alive, doesn't it? So, there are glimpses of this. Even that language about Jacob keeping this saying in mind. I can't read that without thinking about Luke telling us that Mary kept this in her heart. There's just a lot of similarities. Well, verse 29, when Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. So Reuben must have left, whether taking care of the sheep or whatever, but he comes back, he sees Joseph is gone. His plan was to take Joseph back to his dad. When he sees that he's gone, he does what they did in the ancient Near East to show their grief and sorrow. He rips his clothes. And he returned to his brother and he said, the boy is gone. And where shall I go? The meaning being, how am I going to go home? What on earth are we going to say? Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, this we found. Please identify or recognize whether it is your son's robe or not. The word is recognize, and that word's going to come back up in the story down in Egypt when his brothers recognize him, right? So they tell Jacob, hey, can you identify this? Can you recognize this? Do you recognize this tunic? Is this Joseph's? Which, by the way, they would have known this robe. They hated Joseph largely because of this robe. So Jacob should have known something was up, but he identified it and said, it is my son's robe. Now look, he draws the conclusion that they want him to draw. Excuse me. A fierce animal has devoured him. Well, that's exactly what they wanted him to think. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. There's a phrase we'll see later. Remember in Jeremiah, Jeremiah will say, Rachel weeping for her children, but she refused to be comforted. So Jeremiah takes this very phrase and turns it from Jacob refusing to be comforted to Rachel refusing to be comforted. And of course, then Matthew quotes that verse in the New Testament when Herod slaughters all the babies. He quotes that from Jeremiah, says that it's the fulfillment of that. So again, this is why Genesis is so important. All these motifs are being laid out there for the first time that subsequent authors are going to pick up and use under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So he refused to be comforted and said, no, I shall go down to Sheol, to my son mourning. In other words, to death. This is, in the Old Testament, they don't have a developed understanding of heaven and hell. It's death. And in death, they'll be gathered to their ancestors. They'll see their departed loved ones. There is a sense of God being in death. David in the Psalm says, if I descend into Sheol, you're there. If I go up into the highest heavens, you're there. So that they don't have a developed theology of heaven and hell. That comes later. Jesus says a lot about heaven and hell, but you don't find a lot about it in the Old Testament. It's a New Testament teaching. So here he's not saying if I'm going to go to hell, but he is saying I'm going to die. And when I go to death, mourning, that's when I'll be reunited with my son. I'll go down to Sheol to my son, mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Now, I just want to point something out. Remember in the book of Galatians, Paul quotes an Old Testament passage that says, if you sow to the wind, you reap the whirlwind. And he says, whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. Now, if you plant a seed of corn, one kernel of corn, when do you reap that corn? You reap it right then, as soon as you plant it? You always reap it later. Do you reap grapes off of that kernel of corn? What do you reap off that corn? You reap later, you reap in kind. And how many kernels do you reap off that one? A lot. So you reap the same kind of thing, you reap it later, and you reap it in abundance. And this is why Paul says in Galatians that if you sow, you're going to reap. If you sow to the flesh, you're going to of the flesh reap corruption. And if you sow to the wind, you're going to reap the whirlwind. You're going to reap later, but you're going to reap the same thing, but you're going to reap it in abundance. Now let's go back to when Jacob was at home and his father Isaac was an old man. And his father Isaac had a favorite son. It was Esau, right? Esau's going to get the blessing. What does Jacob do to deceive his father? He kills a goat. He prepares a goat, a kid, right, to make it taste like wild game. And he puts the skin on his arm so that he feels like Esau. And he goes in and he deceives his father. Now what happens to him? They kill a goat. They use basically a garment to make him think that something that's true about his son, it's something that's not true is true, and they deceive him. And so here he is, an old man, reaping what he sowed, reaping it later, reaping it in abundance. And man, he's heartbroken because he didn't make Isaac think that Esau was dead. He just made him think he was there. But now a much greater sorrow comes upon him. He feels like he's never going to be happy again. He's going to go to his grave mourning his son. And he refuses to be comforted. The grief is so great. Meanwhile, the Midianites, they take Joseph down to Egypt. They sell him to Potiphar. Potiphar is an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. And with that line, the author's tipping us off. We're going to hear more about this guy, Potiphar. Joseph is now far away from his father. And he's going to go through a lot before they're reunited. I wish I had time to go into it. This Sunday I'm going to be preaching on the prodigal son. But in many ways, the prodigal son is a retelling of the story of Jacob. And it's about Jacob returning to his father. Jesus is sort of retelling the story of Israel, if you will. There's a great book called Jacob. I think it's I can't remember the name of it, but Ken Bailey. It's Jacob and the Prodigal Son, I think. But a tremendous book, and he shows these connections between this story and really the story of the prodigal son and what Jesus is saying about Israel, and how God, what does God do? God laments Israel's departure, but he's reunited with Israel through a son. So there's these themes in Genesis that are just foundational to understanding the rest of the Bible. And the brilliance of Moses here under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit as he lets us see the scene of Jacob now far away. Jacob's at Hebron, far away down in Egypt. Joseph's being sold into the house of Potiphar. And with that, now you're going to have a strange break. He's going to pick the story of Joseph up again in chapter 39. But chapter 38 is about this guy Judah. And it's a tawdry tale, another tawdry tale. We've already had one, and now we're going to get another. And we're going to, so next week we're going to talk about why that tawdry tale is there. And we're going to talk about which one of these two, Judah or Joseph, does Jesus identify with? And we'll pick up there next week.